Corey McKeague was born on September 16, 1993 in the city of Edinburgh, Scotland, but most of his formative years were spent in the town of Dunfermline, just across the River Forth, about 20 miles north of the Scottish capital. After graduating from St. Columba's High School, Corey made the decision to enlist in the Royal British Air Force Army Infantry Regiment, and in 2013, after completing his training, he was assigned to No. 2 Squadron based at an air base near the picturesque English village of Huntington, where he continued training as a gunner and medic. By the summer of 2016, Corey had been with his squadron for nearly 2 years and was an outstanding member of the unit. As with most military branches, No. 2 Squadron lived and died by the motto of "work hard and party hard." For many, receiving a weekend pass meant a night of unreserved revelry and fun, and Corey McKeague, 23 years old at the time, was no exception to the rule. So when he also received a pass for the last weekend in September, he immediately began organizing a night out with friends. Corey's plan was to drive to nearby Bury St. Edmunds, leave his car parked there overnight, and return to base in the morning, when the alcohol was out of his system, or at least down to decent enough levels that he could drive. It seemed like a reliable plan, but little did Corey know that night would become one of the most baffling mysteries in recent British history. On the night of September 23rd, 2016, Corey McKeague and a group of friends drove into town, found a parking spot, and began to drink and enjoy the night. For those unfamiliar with British drinking habits, you should know that it is estimated that British young people in their 20s and 30s are some of the biggest consumers of alcohol in Europe. While a Frenchman or an Italian might enjoy a few glasses of wine to accentuate his joy and uninhibit it a little, the British drink as if they were punishing their own livers. Unfortunately, Corey and his friends were not out of the statistics, and that night drank tirelessly for hours, and in the early hours of the next morning, Corey was so drunk that, according to witnesses, he staggered into a nightclub known as Flex. Looking visibly very intoxicated, it was at this point that one of the bouncers asked him to leave the premises, as it was against club policy to allow extremely drunk patrons such as Corey was that morning to remain inside the premises, as these types of patrons often only cause trouble. Incredibly, despite his state and unlike most of the customers who arrived in such conditions to the premises, the security manager said that Corey responded very well to being ejected from the site. He did not put up any resistance at any time or look for trouble. On the contrary, he remained respectful and responsive to the demands of the bouncer. This man also told police later that Corey even apologized for being too drunk and asked him to inform his friends that he was heading to a nearby fast food restaurant. Moments later, the restaurant's security cameras captured him at the location at approximately 1:15 to 1:30 a.m. He was then arrested at the restaurant. However, instead of staying on site to wait for his friends, he left the restaurant and went into an alley. That same early morning at 3:25 a.m., a security camera on Brent Gold Street captured Corey walking on the sidewalk, somewhat bent over and wobbling a bit because of the state he was in. The direction in which he was moving suggested that he had headed back to the Flex nightclub, probably in search of his friends. However, for some reason he decided to turn onto Brent Gold Street, and that is when the camera loses sight of him as he enters a small cul-de-sac. The small space that Corey entered was apparently being used as garbage storage for an adjacent block of apartments, which meant that there were several tall garbage cans there, known in the UK as garbage bins. There are many hypotheses as to why Corey went into that place, but the one he believes is the correct one has to do with the fact that it is quite common for a drunk young man to look for a hidden area to urinate to avoid being caught on camera, and it seems that is exactly what he went there to do. However, if that were the case, he would have left minutes later, about 5 or 10 at the most. The problem is that after entering that small area with no viable exits, Corey was never seen again. Since he had a weekend pass, Corey's superiors in the regiment, did not notice his absence until Monday, September 26th. Surprisingly, of all the friends he had been drinking with that night, none thought his absence was suspicious in any way. They simply assumed he had driven home to Scotland to spend the rest of his leave there, but did not bother to call him to confirm that this had actually been the case. Once superiors realized they had a missing airman, the British Air Force deployed its own military search and rescue teams to help local law enforcement locate him, but no trace of Corey was found. The police then contacted his mother in the hope that she could shed some light on his behavior, and so it was discovered that he had something of a reputation for sleeping rough when drinking. Apparently, after a night of strength, it was not uncommon for Corey to find a protected doorway or even a bush large enough to get a few hours of sleep. It is this small detail that led to one of the more gruesome theories of what could possibly have happened to him. Using records taken from local police phone towers, it was discovered that on the morning Corey went missing, his Nokia Lumia phone could be traced from the center of Bury St. Edmunds to a location known as Barton Mills, 19 kilometers northwest of the town. Data from the phone indicated that the journey took no more than 28 minutes, meaning it could not have been carried by someone on foot, and this in turn led to a frightening assumption among investigators, the media, and the general public, and that is that some believe that given his habit of sleeping rough, Corey could have climbed into an empty dumpster to sleep for a few hours, and then, considering how busy local nightlife is on a Friday night, a specially scheduled trash pickup could have resulted in a truly gruesome death by crushing. This theory led Suffolk County Police to impound a garbage truck on suspicion that it was carrying Corey's phone. However, after an intensive analysis of the truck's storage compartment, nothing was found that would indicate that this speculation was true, and fortunately, this morbid suspicion was immediately dismissed. In the following days, the police continued to search the route between Bury St. Edmunds and Barton Mills, but sadly no trace of Corey was found, and as hope began to fade and the search narrowed, his mother made a desperate appeal to the general public. In her opinion, someone must have seen her son. He could not have simply vanished into thin air. However, of the dozens of possible witnesses in the area at the time of McKeague's disappearance, not even one came forward with information that could be helpful in locating him. In December 2016, police announced that they were searching a wooded area between Barton Mills and Huntington, assuming that Corey had been the victim of a pre-dawn hit-and-run style vehicle accident. But by the 17th of that same month, it became apparent that the area was no longer of interest to police, by which time, McKeague's mother would have publicly announced that she was mentally preparing for the discovery of her son's body. But just days after the aforementioned search was called off, she made a very shocking accusation. Nicola Urart, Corey's mother, publicly shared her belief that the police were not properly investigating her son's disappearance. She also announced the creation of a GoFundMe page, stating that donations would go towards hiring a private investigator to try and locate her son. The fund attracted over £50,000 in just a few weeks. But before she could go ahead and hire a private investigator, Suffolk police approached Nicola and were assured that their cooperation would continue. A few months later, on March 1, 2017, a 26-year-old man was arrested on suspicion of attempting to hinder the course of justice, and it was later revealed that the man had made a mistake in recording the weight of the garbage truck suspected of containing Corey's remains. The weight of the truck's load was originally recorded as 15 kilograms, and therefore ruled out that it could have transported the young man's body. However, after the arrest of the man in question, it was determined that the actual weight of the truck's cargo was over 90 kilograms. It is not too clear how the police discovered this small detail, but they used it to reverse their original theory that a barely conscious Corey had been crushed by a garbage truck after taking refuge in a dumpster, in the early hours of November 24, 2016. The day after this announcement, Nicola Urart appeared on a popular daytime television program and once again made a shocking accusation, citing inconsistencies within the investigation regarding the two different weights of the garbage truck. Nicola claimed that the data was manipulated or that someone had, and I quote, lied to the police to skew the course of the investigations. Corey's father disagreed, and in a heartbreaking statement to the national press, the man conceded that his son had likely passed away and that he planned to hold a small memorial service for him. During the summer of 2018, in a subsequent statement posted on social media, Corey's father said that his son's remains were likely somewhere in the county's waste disposal system and were essentially unrecoverable. But despite this, the mother refused to stop looking for him and stated that she would continue to seek answers on the basis that Corey was presumed missing rather than presumed deceased. However, in early March 2022, the Suffolk Coroner's Court, Suffolk, concluded that Corey had died after climbing into a commercial dumpster that was then dumped into a garbage truck, so his eventual death was the result of compression asphyxiation in association with multiple injuries. It is worth noting that the coroner's inquest findings were based on a calculation and could be just an estimate made by a highly educated and experienced professional. But it is still just an estimate. In reality, we don't know exactly what happened to Corey McKeague, and the saddest fact about this case is that his fate could forever remain a mystery. However, there are some who claim to know exactly what happened to him, and according to them it is the same thing that has happened to all the missing since the beginning of time, that higher forces took them somewhere. And even if someday we can explain it, we will never be able to stop it. On the evening of Monday, August 30th, 1999, 44-year-old Dr. Yves Godard closed his small practice in the town of Goula in northern France. It had been an uneventful day, and neither the nurses nor the practice secretary had noticed anything unusual with Dr. Godard. The next morning, however, he canceled all remaining appointments and told his staff to take the rest of the week off. When asked if everything was okay, Godard told his staff not to worry and that he would simply take time off to take his children fishing. At this point, he was totally true to his word and took his sons fishing at the ponds at a place called Blanquerie. The next day, September 1st, the doctor loaded his children onto a small gendered sailboat named Nick, and although their mother was absent, 6-year-old Camille and 4-year-old Marius were said to be very excited at the prospect of an adventure at sea. On September 1st, their father told the ship's owner that he intended to take them on a cruise to Perros-Guirec, one that would return on September 5th. But before setting sail, Dr. Godard made a brief stop at the port of Saint-Malo. It was there that he purchased a large quantity of cleaning products, but curiously, these items were left in his Volkswagen camper van, which he had parked in a parking lot in Saint-Malo. The next morning after the Goddard sailed, French customs officials inspected the Nick between the areas of Cabo de Rocky and Capella. They later testified that they had noticed that one of the Goddard children, sleeping in the hold of the boat, everything seemed to be in order. But when the good doctor was asked the reason behind his little cruise, the customs officer observed a very suspicious behavior. He talked to them calmly, but seemed to change his story in the middle of telling it. Each of the customs officers took note of this, but since Dr. Godard did not appear to be breaking any laws, they were unwilling and unable to arrest or detain him. All they could do was corroborate his story with the ship's owner in Saint-Malo, to make sure nothing was too sinister. The following days, several witnesses saw the Nick near Brake Bay. This included a waffle vendor in the small harbor, who formally testified that Godard and his sons came to buy waffles from him on September 3rd. Little did he know, however, that he would be the last person to see the Goddard family alive. The next day, the Nick was spotted by a couple of hikers near a place called Plustek, had been completely abandoned. The next day, on September 5th, the day the boat was supposed to return to San Malo, a small dinghy from the Nick was recovered by a fishing boat. The dinghy appeared to have been abandoned 30 nautical miles off Île-de-Bats in the department of Finistère. In the dinghy was a jacket and a checkbook made out to Goddard. Intrigued by the find, the Gendarmerie Maritime in Roscoff opened an investigation into the family's disappearance. Dr. Goddard's camper van was quickly found parked in Saint-Malo. That's how they discovered the abundance of cleaning supplies hidden in the van's rear storage. But investigators found something considerably more disturbing. Blood. A large amount of blood, along with doses of a pain-killing drug. On September 8th, police conducted a search of the Goddard family home, and it was there that they found more traces of blood, this time in the family bathroom, the living room, and in the parents' bedroom. It was determined that this blood belonged to Marie Goddard, Dr. Yves's second wife, who had not been seen since August 31st of that year. This new discovery led the French police to officially open a judicial investigation for murder against Dr. Yves Goddard, being the main subject of an international arrest warrant. 2 weeks after the Goddard family disappeared, amateur sailors discovered a life jacket belonging to Nick off the coast of the Channel Islands of Guernsey and Aurigny. A week later, on September 23rd, the inflatable survival raft from Goddard's boat was recovered half-deflated on a beach at Lyme Bay in Dorset, England. Those who discovered it noted with grim curiosity how the raft's canvas canopy had been completely removed, something that would make the raft extremely vulnerable to high waves. Due to the presence of Marie Goddard's blood on the van and in the house, the French police had assumed they were investigating a murder. However, the locations of the lift jackets and the survival raft cast a great deal of doubt on the investigations. According to experts, it was impossible for these items to have been found in these locations just as a result of ocean currents. In short, the items had to have been deliberately scattered to appear in their discovered locations, almost as if someone was trying to throw investigators off the scent. But investigators determined that once the emergency inflation of the boat had been dismantled, it could only have remained inflated for 72 hours, meaning that someone had activated the boat at least 24 hours after the Goddards were presumed missing. It took 4 months for the next big break in the case to come, when a duffel bag was caught in a fisherman's net off the coast of Bots Island on January 16, 2000. The bag contained numerous items belonging to all members of the Goddard family, including clothing, driver's licenses, insurance documents, checkbooks, binoculars, a hammer, and the entire contents of Marie France Goddard's personal purse. 6 months later, a seashell collector's boat brought up a human skull during a night fishing trip. Unfortunately, DNA tests revealed that it had once belonged to 6-year-old Camille Goddard, the first of the family to be confirmed dead. The discovery sparked speculation that the Nick had sunk, claiming the lives of the 3 passengers, but despite the fact that the area was being trawled by a French Navy mine-hunting vessel, no trace of the ship was found. On Sunday, February 11, 2001, a man walking his dog on the beach found a business card belonging to Dr. Goddard. Then on February 22nd, a bank card bearing Goddard's name was found on the same stretch of beach. Investigators searched the beach thoroughly and ordered a further inspection of the nearby seabed, but there was still no trace of the ship or the 2 remaining members of the Goddard family. These events led investigators to believe that Dr. Goddard stopped on this beach and emptied the contents of his wallet there, probably as a way to deceive those who might try to find them. Subsequently, more searches of the beach were conducted, including a tractor that was used to sift the sand, but no further personal effects of Goddard or his family were found. However, it was discovered that all of these cards had not been in the water for a long time before they were discovered, and therefore had not been dumped in the water in September 1999. Analysts believed that they had actually been dropped into the English Channel sometime in early 2001. At that point, for everyone involved, the situation was clear. Someone was trying to make it look like the death of Yves Goddard and his children was an accident, but it remained to be seen whether it was the killer in question, an accomplice, or Dr. Goddard himself. It was not until September 13, 2006 that Dr. Yves Goddard was officially declared dead, when two bones consisting of a femur and tibia were washed up from the seabed near a place called Herd's Deep, and upon DNA analysis, were shown to belong to Dr. Goddard. The confirmation of the doctor's death put an end to most of the public interest in the case, as an accident was considerably less scandalous than a quadruple murder. But there was still the matter of Dr. Goddard's missing wife, Marie. In light of this, the court file was not immediately closed, and it could be argued that some rather odd potential sightings contributed to it remaining open. In October 1999, not long after the Goddard had disappeared, the owner of a hotel on the Isle of Man claimed that Goddard and his children had stayed at his hotel between September 7th and 14th. This was the first in a series of witness statements placing Goddard and his children in various locations around the world after his disappearance. Sightings of them were also reported in Scotland, South Africa, Florida, and Crete. However, perhaps the most credible sighting was on the Portuguese island of Madeira. Investigators discovered that Yves had inexplicably opened the bank account there in the time prior to his disappearance, but it is unclear whether this was part of a larger plan that resulted in his accidental death. What is certain, however, is that although Dr. Goddard placed funds in the account at the time of its creation, these funds remained untouched after the family's disappearance. Finally, in September 2012, the San Malo Public Prosecutor's Office stated that the only hypothesis we can exclude is that the family's disappearance was a simple boating accident, and although this is the most likely line of investigation, we cannot formally confirm that Yves Goddard murdered his family. And with that, the case of the missing Goddard family was finally closed. However, questions still linger about the nature of their disappearance, as the prosecutor stated that the only thing they can be sure of is that this was not just a simple boating accident. There was definitely foul play of some sort. We don't know if this really was a bizarre and tragic attempt by Yves Goddard to eliminate his own family, or the whole thing was perpetrated by some faceless, shadowy figure who, for all intents and purposes, committed the perfect crime. The celebrated Welsh musical group, Manic Street Preachers, is today best known for soft rock, hit melancholy, motorcycle vice, and design for life. But in the early 1990s, the band seemed to be heading in a much bolder artistic direction, influenced by a young man by the name of Richard James Edwards. Born in December 1967 in the South Wales town of Blackwood, Richie demonstrated a brooding intelligence from an early age. He went on to study political history at university, but always remained close to his elementary school friends, James, Nicky, and Sean, whom he had met while attending Oakdale Comprehensive. By 1986, the trio had formed a band, and although Richie lacked any musical talent, he was willing to contribute to the band's success, doing so indirectly by writing lyrics and contributing creative ideas in image and staging. During much of their 1989 UK tour, Richie won the hearts of fans across the country with his frenetic antics during their live shows, often mimicking the act of playing guitar while immersing the audience in a frenzy. But he wasn't just a hyperactive, over-the-top man, he was a genuine artist in his own right, and although he couldn't physically contribute to the band's music, His vision and poetry greatly influenced both the sound and lyrical content of Manic Street Preacher's songs. So, in light of this, after concluding their tour in '89, Ritchie was officially invited to become the band's fourth member and spokesman. In 1994, on the release of the band's third album, The Holy Bible, Ritchie was responsible for about 80% of the band's lyrics, which revealed his great sensitivity and depth of thought. For example, Ritchie once showed his bandmates a poem that read, "Blessed be the sword, blessed be the scythe, Dionysus against the crucified, cleanse your flesh and mock your fears, the brightest sun is the purest weapon." These 27 words alone generated hundreds of separate thoughts on religion, culture clashes, mortality, and the nature of the universe itself. A few months later, the poem was used word for word as most of the lyrics for the song Judge Yourself, one of the biggest hits of the band's career. Ritchie did it again and again. He was the band's muse, someone to whom their fans clung to his anguish and melancholy made flesh. But to say Ritchie was a tortured genius would be the understatement of the century, for from an early age he suffered from a deep and unshakable depression, something that became apparent during a 1991 interview with an NME journalist, when his artistic integrity was called into question, and his response was no less than disturbing. On that occasion, the journalist suggested that the pessimistic view of the world he displayed in his lyrics was nothing more than a carefully curated facade. Upon hearing this, Ritchie sketched a wry smile before asking, "Do you want to see what I'm really like?" The journalist nodded, and at that, he pulled a razor blade from somewhere on his person and began to cut his left forearm. The journalist recoiled on the spot, horrified to see that Ritchie appeared to be dismembering himself. The series of cuts he gave himself required 18 stitches afterwards. In the face of this, he later stated that he regularly self-harmed, either by cutting himself or stabbing cigarettes into his arms and legs. "It makes me feel a lot better," he said at the time. In that same interview, Ritchie stated that he did that because at the time, all the little things that might have bothered him suddenly seemed trivial, because he was just concentrating on the blood or the pain. "I am not a person who can scream and shout, so this is my only way out," were his words followed. These words and this extremely melancholic and depressive behavior at the time were shocking, but after the events that followed, they would take on a much greater meaning and become the focus of the entire investigation. Prior to the release of the band's third album, Ritchie was admitted to Woodchurch Hospital and later to Priory Hospital. Both specialize in addiction and mental health issues. During the recording of The Holy Bible, Ritchie had been suffering from insomnia and drank heavily to fall asleep at night. It had gotten so bad that, as singer James Dean Bradfield said, inevitably the day would start with a can opening when he came out of rehab. Ritchie's condition seemed to have improved. Somehow he was clean, sober, and had refrained from self-harm during his hospital stay, except during an appearance at the London Astoria. On December 21, 1994, he revealed that the improvements were merely superficial. Towards the end of the set, on Closer You Love Us, Ritchie began smashing his guitar and damaging the venue's lighting system. Manic's fans mistook this for Ritchie's usual onstage antics, not realizing they were watching him perform for the last time. In February 1995, the Manic Street Preachers achieved something that most, if not all, British musicians aim for, that elusive American tour mounting their album, The Holy Bible. The wave of grunge hits that came to characterize the early to mid-90s and Epic Records hoped to capitalize on it. As you can imagine, everyone who knew or worked with the band was incredibly excited for them, but the band itself was becoming increasingly anxious. It was mainly due to Ritchie's increasingly bizarre behavior in the 2 weeks leading up to the band's tour. Richie withdrew 200 pounds a day from his bank account, for a total of 2,800 pounds on the day of the scheduled flight. Richie mentioned that this was a way to pay for a new desk for his apartment. However, there was no record of the desk having been paid for, and this would have accounted for only half of the money withdrawn. The night before the flight to the United States, Richie gave a friend a book called Novella with Cocaine, which details the author staying in an insane asylum before disappearing. He also gave a gift to his own girlfriend, although they had reportedly broken up for good only a few weeks earlier. The next morning, instead of traveling to the airport with the rest of the band, Richie left his hotel, drove to his apartment in Cardiff, and left his passport there. After that, he seemed to literally disappear off the face of the earth. Just a few days later, he was officially reported missing by his bandmates. Weeks later, Richie was apparently seen in several different places. One witness said he saw a man almost identical in appearance at the Newport passport office, and, in an apparently more reliable case, a Richie fan spotted him at the Newport bus station, chatting with him briefly before saying goodbye. A cab driver later came forward claiming to have picked Richie up from the King's Hotel in Cardiff before taking him around several towns in the Welsh Valley, including Richie's hometown of Blackwood. The driver claimed that although the passenger had spoken with a Cockney accent, he had occasionally slipped into a Welsh, one that had sounded considerably more natural. He thought nothing of it until he heard the news of Richie's disappearance, at which point it seemed oddly pertinent. The driver also stated that the passenger had alighted at the Severn View service station in South Gloucestershire, and this gives his claims a great deal of credibility. In fact, that's because in mid-February, Richie's car was discovered at the same service station with a flat battery. The Vauxhall Cavalier had been abandoned for several days when police found it. There was ample evidence that Richie had been living in the car for some time, with takeaway containers and empty alcohol bottles strewn throughout the interior. There were also several photographs of Richie's parents and siblings, which had apparently been taken in the previous weeks. The location of the discovery of the car was particularly worrying for all involved, as the Severn View service station refers to the River Severn and the bridge across it, a well-known place where people take their own lives. Despite this, many of Richie's loved ones insisted that he was never the type of person to contemplate that sort of thing, referring to a quote from the previous year in which Richie said, "In terms of the word suicide, it doesn't enter my mind and never has in terms of an attempt, because I'm stronger than that. I might be a weak person, but I can take the pain." Despite the fact that no body was ever found, the claim that Richie is still alive has been backed up by dozens of eyewitness sightings. The frequency of these sightings meant that his family was extremely reluctant to declare him dead, and only did so in November 2008, 6 years after they were legally entitled to do so. However, some of those closest to Richie take a much more pessimistic view of the situation. For example, Richie's sister once mentioned how her favorite poem was Tulips by Sylvia Plath. It summed up everything she was thinking at the time. She said she kept a copy of it and asked that it be read to her at her funeral. This poem, The Themes and Messages Tulips, describes Plath's desire for death, while the titular tulips seem to want her to live on. It is a poem of soul-crushing depression and conflict, and the fact that it spoke to Richie so deeply leads us to some very dark conclusions. In fact, the more cynical among us might postulate that Richie is dead and has been since 1995. But money talks. Although it might be a purely symbolic gesture, the Manic Street Preachers have been paying 25% of their royalties into Richie's bank account since he disappeared. They were doing this until 2005, and a considerable amount has accumulated in his name, almost as if they were waiting for him to come home. As Manic bassist Nikki Wire once said, "It's a real rock and roll mystery." And she's right. We have no definitive answers in this case, and no matter how likely it seems that Richie took his own life, there is simply no evidence to support such a hypothesis. In fact, it's just as likely that it looks that way because Richie wanted it to look that way. He amassed a small fortune in cash at the time he disappeared, and it's quite possible that Richie visited the Newport passport office to pick up a different passport than the one he left in his apartment, perhaps even a passport with a different name. And if that's the case, then all those sightings of him start to sound a little more believable. Perhaps by escaping the spotlight and avoiding the rock and roll lifestyle he had once embraced, Richie learned to stop judging and hurting himself, and finally began to heal. On Boxing Day night in 1996, childhood friends David Spencer and Patrick Warren set off from their homes in the English town of Sally Hall to play outdoors. Patrick was riding his brand new bicycle, his most cherished Christmas present that year, while his friend David was on foot. Supposedly they had headed to a place called Meredith Park, where they had played with other children near the park's pond. Due to the season's frigid temperatures, the park pond was completely frozen over. As David and Patrick played with a group of other children, a police officer recalled warning them to stay away from the frozen pond. Patrick then returned home and informed his parents that they were headed to the home of one of Patrick's elders. Patrick had several older siblings at the time, some of whom had moved out of the family home due to their advanced age. When the children did not arrive home later that night, their parents assumed that they had slept at Patrick's brother's house. However, when this brother informed them that the children had not arrived the night before, the first pangs of panic set in. The boys' parents quickly discovered that the last known sighting of them had been when a gas station employee gave them a package of cookies just after midnight. The employee added that he saw the children walking in the direction of a local shopping center. Police searched this gas station only to discover Patrick's new red Apollo bicycle abandoned behind the gas station's trash cans, which explains why both children were on foot at the time of the sighting. At first, the local police force treated the children's disappearance like any other missing person case, and refused to acknowledge that the children may have been victims of a crime. The decision was later criticized by the general public, who defended the view of a criminologist that if it had been two middle-class children who went missing, that case would initially have been treated very differently. It was a class judgment that was made, which was primed to see them as runaways rather than vulnerable. Some argued that this same bias meant that the child's disappearance received very little media attention beyond the local media. However, it should be noted that David and Patrick's faces were the first to appear on milk cartons. The National Missing Persons Helpline had noticed that a similar initiative in the United States had been very successful and launched an almost identical campaign in April 1997. A few days after the boys went missing, the body of 17-year-old Nicola Dixon was discovered in a cemetery above a neighboring Sutton coal field. Her killer was arrested, charged, and convicted of murder, although many of the boys' loved ones insisted that the man may have been involved in his disappearance. He was never investigated or questioned in connection with it. It also appears that the Nicola Dixon case absorbed most of the news coverage, leaving Patrick and David on the back burner. In light of this, police resources were invested in the former case, while the latter appears to have been almost completely neglected. Weeks of no answers turned into months of mystery, and as the years passed, the family seemed no closer to finding out what had happened to David and Patrick. In 2003, the family's hopes were renewed when West Midlands police announced that they had arrested a 37-year-old man in connection with the disappearances, but these hopes were quickly dashed when he was later released on bail shortly afterwards. To date, no formal charges had been filed against this individual. The arrest appears to have merely muddied the waters on what was already a complicated problem. On the 10th anniversary of their disappearance, the boys were the subject of a BBC Crime Watch special, which sought new information from potential witnesses. Nearly 250,000 Britons tuned in. but the appeal failed to generate a single new lead. It was only after a second Crime Watch special began to trickle in, but it seems to have been a case of quality rather than quantity, because shortly afterwards the police declared that they were closer than ever to learning the truth of David and Patrick's fate, although this lead was not revealed to the public. For some time it appeared that their suspect was a convicted murderer named Brian Field. Brian had also been convicted of possessing indecent images of minors, and given the boys' ages, this obviously made him the prime suspect. However, despite a series of interviews and dozens of hours of investigation, no confession could be secured, and no tangible link between Field and the two children could be established, meaning any attempt at conviction would ultimately be fruitless in contrast to his inability to build a case against him. The circumstantial evidence supporting Brian Field's guilt was almost overwhelming. His previous conviction was for the murder of Roy Tootle, a 14-year-old schoolboy, in 2001. The murder had occurred in 1968, but new DNA evidence has secured a guilty verdict. And at the time of Patrick and David's disappearance, Brian had been living just a block from the gas station where they were last seen. He worked as a self-employed gardener for several local families, which means there's a good chance the boys were not only familiar with him, but might have trusted him as a prominent figure in their community. This means that if Brian had stopped to offer them a ride, as he had done with little Roy Tootle, there is no reason why they would have been wary of getting into his vehicle. Furthermore, he had been convicted of attacking two teenagers after offering them a ride once they had gotten into his car. Brian threatened them with a wheel stand and told them to take off their clothes, but fortunately both were able to jump out of the moving car. Brian remains the only person in British criminal history to have been convicted of something like this. Apparently, the police had to change the law just to punish him for such a bizarre and terrifying crime. In 2006, forensic examiners unearthed a piece of land that Brian had once used as a dumping ground on Old Damson Lane in Solihull, but unfortunately found nothing belonging to David or Patrick. It was later established that Brian had been driving in the area where the boys had been the same night he disappeared. He also admitted to driving while drunk. It should be noted that Field was known to have become violent when drunk and committed most of his crimes under the influence of alcohol. And by his own admission, alcohol was a trigger for him to want to commit his crimes. There was also evidence that Field had been seen talking to the boys in the days leading up to the disappearance, suggesting that Field may have groomed the children in the time before this happened. This could explain why no one heard screaming or a struggle on the night of the boys' disappearance, as it is possible that the children already knew Field and willingly got into his vehicle. Graham Hill, the detective who obtained Brian's confession in 2001, has stated on numerous occasions that he believes Brian is responsible for the child's disappearance. He has also expressed doubt that any of the children survived that night they were abducted. In 2016, a fresh appeal for information was launched by West Midlands Police, promising that the force would never close the case until it discovered what had happened to David and Patrick. But here we are, almost 6 years later, and we are still no closer to finding out what happened to them. It should be noted, however, that this is not so much due to police incompetence as to the difficulty of the case. Despite their early reluctance to act, law enforcement has invested time and resources in finding David and Patrick at this point. It seems far more likely that the only reason the boys had not been found is that the monster who killed them refuses to reveal their final resting places. Derek James Engebretson was born on July 5, 1990 in the small town of Klamath Falls, Oregon. He was an intelligent but shy young man with a love of the outdoors. He had brown hair, dark eyes, and a bright smile. On December 5, 1998, 8-year-old Derek agreed to accompany his father and grandfather to Pelican Butte, near Rocky Point, Oregon. The trio planned to find a suitable Christmas tree that they could cut down and transport back to their home. It was an annual tradition for the men in the family, and Derek was visibly excited to be the one in charge of choosing the family Christmas tree. The trio drove to Pelican Butte, parked their truck, and then wandered through the snowy woods, dodging Derek's snowballs as they walked. Finally, they found a tree of suitable size, and after making sure it met Derek's approval, his father and grandfather began to cut it down. It was a scene not far from what you might find on a Christmas card, but unbeknownst to the Engebrettsons, that day would end in a living nightmare. As Derek's father and grandfather worked on cutting down the tree he had selected, they momentarily took their eyes off it. They stopped watching him for no more than 2 or 3 minutes, but when they looked again, little Derek had disappeared. Knowing that he couldn't have gotten very far on foot, Derek's father ran through the woods looking for tracks and calling the boy's name, but strangely enough, he was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, Derek's father realized something terrifying. To have disappeared so suddenly and completely, someone or something must have taken his son. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Derek's father and grandfather ran back to their truck and hurried to the nearest telephone. Then, at exactly 4:13 p.m., Derek Engebretson was officially declared a missing person. Despite the impending loss of daylight, the Klamath County Sheriff's Department immediately began their search effort. They flooded the area around Pelican Butte with deputies and sniffer dogs, and at first their hopes were high. Derek's parents told police that their son had grown up in the mountains and had been taught a handful of cold weather survival techniques. In addition, Derek's father mentioned that at the time of his disappearance, his son was in possession of a small axe, which meant that despite being only 8 years old, he had a much better chance of defending himself than other children his age. As the police continued their search, evidence of his upbringing was evident. Toward dawn, officers discovered a small rudimentary shelter made of spruce branches and fallen logs nearby. They found a trail of small footprints in the snow, and after following them, the agents discovered that the tracks formed a loop from the spot where Derek's father had last seen him to a small clearing in the woods near a road. However, what they found there, given the circumstances, was truly bizarre. A snow angel. As you can imagine, this raised many questions. Given that these were the only footprints found in the area, it made sense that they belonged to Derek, but it didn't make sense that he would suddenly stop to make a snow angel. There was no way he would have covered that much ground in the period of time his father stopped paying attention to him, and a lost and panicked child would not be in the mood to play in the snow. Suggestions that the snow angel was evidence of a physical struggle were dismissed because it was too well formed to be anything but deliberate. Police attempted to continue following the small footprints, but a blizzard made their efforts extremely difficult. Once the blizzard subsided, the search resumed. More tracker dogs were sent to Pelican Butte, and several civil air patrol planes joined search and rescue helicopters to scan the area from the air. Unfortunately, not a single trace of Derek was found, and just 8 days later, the search was terminated. Derek's family continued the investigation independently of law enforcement for quite some time, but were unable to find anything. Subsequently, they were joined by hundreds of civilian volunteers from all over North America, but again, no progress was made. Then one day, a member of the public approached the police with alarming information. On the day of the disappearance, he claimed to have seen a man struggling with a child in the area where Derek went missing. Additional reports were also made about an unidentified man driving a 2-door pickup truck who had been asking passers-by for directions into the woods. Police made efforts to track the man, but were unsuccessful. Less than a year later, on September 24, 1999, the Harney County, Oregon, Sheriff's Department received a call from a horrified member of the public. They had discovered graffiti in the bathroom at the Sage Hen Rest area, more than 200 miles from Pelican, and it referenced Derek's abduction. When told what the graffiti said, Derek's mother told the media, "I think it's just a sick joke. If someone took Derek, yes, they wrote this on the wall, they wanted to get caught. If they wanted to get caught, why didn't they leave something of Derek there?" Many have speculated on what exactly was written on that wall, but to this day it has never been made public. This is likely due to honoring a personal request made by Derek's family, as if they truly believed it was nothing more than a sick joke. There would be no purpose in releasing it. However, based on what Derek's mother said, it is not hard to infer what was written. Someone claimed to have taken the boy and, most likely, claimed to have kept him alive, or at least kept his body as some sort of sick trophy. The implication that they might have left something of Derek's at the truck stop strongly implies that they were in possession of some of his personal effects. In 2008, police confirmed that a man named Frank James Milligan was considered a possible suspect in Derek's disappearance. At the time, he was serving a lengthy sentence for raping a 10-year-old boy in a town outside Salem, Oregon, and the modus operandi appeared identical to that used in Derek's disappearance. But to date, Milligan has yet to be charged in connection with Derek's case, and an eventual conviction seems less and less possible. Who could have pulled Derek right out from under his father's nose? Milligan would have had to stalk the family through the woods and then sneak out quietly, which is impossible given the thick blanket of snow on the ground. If they were using chainsaws to cut down their Christmas tree, it would be feasible that Derek's father wouldn't hear their screams. But the two men were using an axe on each other, which is hardly capable of making enough noise to cover up the abduction of a child. If Frank Milligan is not to blame for Derek's disappearance, who is? The truth of what happened to Derek that day has remained a mystery for a quarter of a century, and his case is unlikely to be solved anytime soon. But the question still remains. Did Derek fall victim to a most despicable but explainable form of predator, be it animal or human? Or did something else happen out there in the woods that day, something we are not yet prepared for?